Good morning. To introduce myself, I'm Andy Powell. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at AP Maersk. And I've been there for 18 months. I wasn't there during the cyber attack 2 years ago. I was the guy who came in afterwards. Read into that what you wish, and I'll explain a little bit as we go forward. The thing I love about Black Hat is it's one of the few places where the guy wearing the suit is the odd guy, okay? Which is great. I think it's a really good thing about this conference in particular. By way of background, I spent 28 years in the Royal Air Force. I was the Chief Information Officer and Chief Information Security Officer of the Royal Air Force, and also ran cyber defense operations for the Ministry of Defense for 2 years. When I left 6 years ago, I ran the cyber practice for CSC, and then the cyber practice for Capgemini, selling cybersecurity to companies like Maersk. I decided it was time to walk the talk, and when Maersk made me an offer, I came over onto the other side. So I've seen both sides, both the vendor and the user perspective. What this presentation is aiming to do is primarily bring a key thing to your attention. The most important thing is that 2 years ago, or over 2 years ago now, in June 2017, the world changed completely. For those of us in industry trying to defend our networks, the world changed. Because for the first time, we could be the victim or collateral victim of a state-sponsored cyber weapon, which is exactly what happened. And what that really woke us up as a company was, what would we do to try and counter that or react to that in the future? So this is as much about what we've done subsequently as about the attack itself. So it's really in two parts. What happened during the attack? How do we cope with that? What was the resilience, posture, and how do we move? What were the golden lessons? But really, the major part is what we've done subsequently and why. And hopefully there's some good lessons in there. There's some time at the end for questions, and we'll go into that then. So, as I mentioned, I'm going to talk about NotPetya, what we did at the time, the damage that was done, and why. We'll look about the implementation of the lessons. I'll talk about some of the strategic changes from my perspective that we, as a community, need to be aware of. Many of you are probably already aware of them, but if you're not, I will re-emphasize them. And then primarily I'm going to look at how we sustain what we've put in place, because that's as critical as anything else. Okay, so cyber incident itself. Those of you who are, many of you will be aware of what happened with NotPetya at the time. It was a really interesting background scenario. We were not alone. Maersk is one of the few companies that's been open, transparent, and honest about what happened during that attack. A number of big international companies did not take the same approach and hid from the impact, tried to disguise it, tried to shy away from it. I think Maersk did the right thing. By being open and transparent about what happened and why, it has been able to leverage a lot of support, both from our suppliers and from a lot of partners that we brought on board. I think much more than many of the companies that opted not to. So we'll talk about that. So, for those of you who are not familiar with Maersk, we move 20% of world trade and 33% of the world's bananas. So 1 in 3 of the bananas you have in your house was put there by us. All right? Just remember that when you're eating the banana next time, and thank Maersk for your banana. But we move that amount of trade. We are, if we were brought down, 20% of the world trade would be disrupted. That's quite important. Does it add to my sleep at night? Not really. Okay? But that's quite important. 753 ships. Most of our vessels can take 19,000 20-foot ISO containers. Okay? 74 ports and terminals globally we own and operate. And then a number of large warehousing capabilities and 300 tugs. So just imagine that amount of infrastructure that supports the business. It's quite phenomenal. And I'll talk later about the challenge that really is starting to face us around operational technology. For those of you who are in that space, the whole challenge around OT and how we secure that in the cyber sense has really come to the fore as well. But that's the size of the company. And 2.5 years ago, it was like the rest of the shipping industry and the logistics and supply industry in terms of its maturity. It sat pretty low on the sector maturity scale. At the top, the banks and the governments who've spent a lot of time and money on protecting what they've got. In the middle, we had primarily the sort of the retail business, and closer to the bottom, we had the manufacturing and we had the logistics supply type capability. So we were very similar to most of our competitors and most of the industry at the time, in that the network was not at the time considered a critical part of the company. It supported company operations in the mindset of most of what they did, but really it was an asset-focused company. Like most, it was about ships, it was about ports, it was about containers. And the fundamental lesson was, actually, what was lying underneath was connecting all that together and making it work. The manual fallback was not there. And we'll talk about that as we go forward. And it will be even less so in the future, as automation starts to move far more into these sectors. So therefore, the impact will be far more difficult to counter, and we'll talk about that. So the reason I show our rather nice headquarters in Copenhagen, where I seem to spend most of my life, on a sunny day, on June the 27th, my boss, who was 2 weeks into being the CIO, sat just by the flag, having a photograph taken, when his phone went off to tell him that things were looking a bit awkward. Okay? Bit awkward was probably the understatement of the year. Because what had happened, and I'll talk about this in a second, is that within 7 minutes of the NotPetya striking our network, most of our network capability was down. 7 minutes. Most of the damage was done within an hour. And we spent most of the time after that recovering. So really, most of that catastrophic damage was done in what I now call the golden hour. And it's the golden hour principle that's one of the key principles I actually use at this stage. Not surprisingly, Adam quite quickly reached out for as much support as he could get. And this is the first golden lesson. By telling our suppliers and our customers what was happening straight away, we got support. Really, really important. Microsoft were brilliant. They immediately leaned in to try and understand what was going on. But not surprisingly, they were as a little bit shocked as most of us about what this was doing and how. Okay? Microsoft were trying to help us develop patches as we went, but it was pretty clear that we were not going to be able to sort of counter what was going on. And I'll talk about why in a moment. But the reality of life was the suppliers reached in to help us. Our main outsourced supplier is IBM. They were our main supporter, running our data centers and a lot of our background capability. Microsoft, one of our key suppliers, all dropped everything and came to help us because we were open with them. Similarly, our clients started calling us. Clearly, they were slightly worried about where their bananas were going to be. But the most important reason they started to call us, funnily enough, is we started telling them what was happening. Their first response was, how can we help? Good. Okay. Doesn't always work. There were a few of them who were a little bit more worried about where their container was going to be. But at the end of the day, it was very, very open and transparent. NotPetya. For those of you who are far more expert at what NotPetya was and have done the forensics, and we have a forensics report that big that we commissioned with a number of providers to look at what NotPetya was. And what NotPetya was not a ransomware capability whatsoever. It was a state-sponsored cyber weapon disguised to look like a ransomware attack. It was deeply unpleasant and deeply aimed at disruption. It was aimed at disrupting the economy of the Ukraine. And the reason I raise that is we had an office in Kiev. And like all people who do business in the Ukraine, we had to put our taxes into the Ukrainian tax system via an application called MEDOCS. It was mandatory. It was required. And it was through the MEDOCS software, which was effectively the equivalent of your HMRC software you put your tax return into, we entered all our tax information through that. It was through the MEDOCS application that NotPetya was spread. Basically, an individual within the company who provided the software was, we believe, coerced or blackmailed, or bribed, some months before to provide the credentials to enable a third party to insert the malware into the next upgrade to MEDOCS. And it was that upload that then caused what happened. But anybody who thinks it was some smart front door methodology to get it in, it wasn't. As we understand it, it was coercion or bribery through an individual user, which is a golden lesson in itself about how many of our third-party software suppliers represent quite a large risk to us, which also is something I'll touch on later. But as you can see, a lot of the open media was very clear about what NotPetya wasn't at the time. It used about 4 different forms of exploit to get at us, 2 of which are pretty much open press. 1 most people can guess at, 1 most people couldn't guess at. And there's often a story about, well, if you'd been fully patched with Windows 10, everything was up to date, you could have stopped it. No, because one of the exploits would not have allowed us to do that. And one of the reasons for that is that most of what we did was standard operating procedures. We had a server based in Ukraine for us to operate with. That server was run in the standard way most Microsoft based servers are run, and it was through the methods by which that server was run that the 4th exploit was able to operate and spread across our network so quickly. So we have looked long and hard about could we have stopped it, and the answer is no. What we could have done is potentially we could have contained it, but at the time we were at the same standard as our competitors in terms of the network's maturity, and in reality having that level of containment across such a broad network is really difficult to do. We've subsequently done quite a lot of work around that, and I'll explain the challenges of trying to bring in containment across your network. But the reality is that's what we faced. So I've talked about how it got in. I've talked about how it exploited the network. You can imagine the reaction of our users. Okay? This was something foreign. This had never happened before. Their screens were going black, and strange messages were popping up. But in reality, things were being taken out. What was taken out? That. What was the most profound thing that hit our company, do you think? Not a rhetorical question. Any volunteers, do you think the most critical component that was taken out that could have killed the company of all of that? Yeah. Yeah, I've heard all sorts of reputation, etc., but I'd actually say it was the Active Directory node. For those of you who run these sorts of Microsoft-based networks, AD is king. It is your engine room. It is the thing that runs your network. If you don't look after it, nurture it, love it, it will kill you. All right? So golden lesson, Active Directory is king. What was the key thing about Active Directory was that all our Active Directory nodes were taken out, bar 1. Okay? All our online backups were taken out. All our online backups were taken out by NotPetya. It was designed to destroy online backup, designed specifically to prevent you being able to recover using online methods. Okay, another golden lesson. How many of you have got properly utilized offline backup that you properly manage? There's a few hands going up. There's probably a few people in the room going, oh, I better look into that when I get home. Okay? Trust me, it is the best thing to invest in, because a lot of these sorts of high-level nation-state weapons will take out all your online. Okay? Active Directory node, all our AD nodes were taken out. We had no copy of our Active Directory, we thought. We had nothing to restart the network. So it's a bit like not having any jump leads to restart your Active Directory. We didn't have it. Unfortunately for us, there was a power cut in Lagos. And our office in Lagos, which had an Active Directory node, was offline during the attack. Now, I like to think that was designed specifically during that period. But in reality, we were very fortunate. And a very lucky individual sat in Lagos, got a first-class seat on the next aeroplane out, and sat next to him in first class was the Active Directory server. It's probably the best moved piece of equipment in the world, and he was not to let it out of his sight until it got to the Maidenhead office. We used that to restart everything and rebuild everything. It's very, very fortunate. But let me be really clear. At that time, 2.5 years ago, very few people would realize that a state-sponsored weapon could do that to that degree. Okay? The other things that were taken out quite obviously, were our applications. So one of the other key things we discovered, and this is another bit of a non-rhetorical question, how many of you believe you have no shadow IT in your organization? Excellent. Okay. I introduced a policy of bring out your dead, okay, where I hold nobody accountable or culpable if they bring out and tell me what they've done. Okay, they don't get told off. They just tell me what they've done so I know where it is. Visibility, visibility, visibility. I'd rather know about it than not. So when we started rebuilding our applications and started them again and went to our people, hey, the application's working, they went, guess what they said? No, it's not. Because people had built macros to link applications. And I hate it. Excel macros stink. All right? But they run companies. Most major companies in the world have got all these lovely macros running to make life simpler. And if you take them out and don't restart them, all these applications are singing away and not talking to each other because the manual person who remembered who designed that isn't there anymore. Okay? So we had a real challenge redesigning and getting all those macros back up. That was one of the challenges this went through. But you can see the sort of damage that was done. We bought every laptop in the UK. I had people walking around, well, I wasn't there, but they had people walking around with credit cards, going into PC World and buying every laptop they could find, which made us really popular. Okay? Really popular. It's funny the prices went up as well. I don't know why that was. Okay, so this was phenomenal. I mean, I was, at the time at Capgemini, I had a number of companies reached out and I was helping them recover from NotPetya as well. So I had a lot of experience with other companies as we were going through NotPetya. But Maersk themselves implemented a recovery method which is really, really good. Shipping lines are designed to be able to recover from disasters. They're used to actually stopping ships sinking or containers falling off the side of ships. But they implemented the same methodology to do what they did here, and it worked. The command and control arrangement was really, really good. But the most important thing that we learned was that WhatsApp was a really good application. And the people running the company were below the age of 25 by the end of this, okay? Because they're the only ones who knew how to use WhatsApp groups. Because what we did is we used WhatsApp, because all our phones had gone. They're all IP-based phones. We lost all our phones. So mobiles were king. And what people were doing is forming WhatsApp groups. And do you know what we've done since? We took all those WhatsApp groups that were formed at the time, and we've used that to remodel our business. Because that was how people worked. They created groups around the way they operated. And we've gone back in and looked at those groups and used that to help rebuild our business processes. So there was a really great bit of fallout from the attack. I mean, some might say it was great we had the attack because it helped us redesign our business. But those WhatsApp groups were formed by many of our younger staff, and they were brilliant. Because what they were doing was being able to group people together, come up with decisions, and work out how to solve problems. Problems were solved in those groups. They were collated together through a centralized command and control in Maidenhead, and basically every single packet of crisps in Maidenhead was bought by us as well to feed our people living 24/7 for that period. But the reality of those 4 to 9 days is we built the initial 2,000 laptops literally in the office from scratch, and I had some very, very happy people singing and whistling, or so I was told at the time, that these people were really, really pleased. The Active Directory node, as I say, was built, and the individual who brought it across from Lagos was lauded and given a free meal and sent back with a first-class plane ticket, and we were able to rebuild the systems going forward. So it took us 9 days to get Active Directory back up. 9 days. And in those 9 days, before we could refire the network, you can imagine the logistics problem we had. 19,000 containers a ship, okay? 4 or 5 ship visits to a port. You can just start doing the maths. We didn't know what was inside the containers. We knew what was inside the reefers, the refrigerated containers, bananas, okay? Medicines, okay? We had to get those. Those were our priority, the cold chain, because those medicines had a lifetime expiry issue and a temperature control issue. So we moved all those to our end clients. But we had a lot of empty containers, so a lot of containers we didn't know what was in. Given we moved most to Primark, there was a real danger that my daughter wasn't going to be able to get to Primardi and buy her clothes for the summer. Okay? So the reality of life was we had to find out what was in the containers. So there was a fantastic effort to use the people at the ports and the terminals, use many of our suppliers to help us to identify what was there, and more importantly, talk to our clients about delaying that. But I want to bring out one very important thing that we've done since. So I'm going to say it now. 9 days to recover your Active Directory isn't good enough. Okay? Every company should aspire to have Active Directory back up and running after an attack within 24 hours. Because if you don't, you can't do anything else. So that's one of the key lessons that we learned, and we've spent a lot of time and effort around that. So, what about the lessons? Changing threat landscape. Nation-state weapons are even more pervasive than they were. Okay? They're all out there. What's really worrying is that those nation-state weapons, which are high-end, well-developed, are moving into the hands of proxies. Okay? Criminal organizations acting on behalf of the nation-state. The kickback is that they can keep whatever funding and money they can make from it, and the quid pro quo is the nation-state uses the weapon to get inside big corporation networks. That is really starting to happen big time, and we're seeing that. Don't get me wrong, most of the attacks, and like most companies, we're being attacked all the time. Okay? I'm not pretending we're not. The good news is that we're actually coping with that. The reality is most of those attacks are criminal, still in nature. Okay? But behind some of those, we're now starting to see nation-state actors. The APTs many of us recognize, okay, are operating. We've identified at least 3 key APTs who've used a proxy to get into our networks over the last 6 months. Okay? And we've been able to stop that, but they're doing this to all the major companies around the globe. It's a constant war of attrition. They're also using multiple attack vectors, and what I used to call it sleight of hand. Okay? All of us are used to trying to stop the front door. Okay? It's the guy getting through the back window that you should worry about. And that's what's happening with many of these attack vectors. They're lulling you into the front door while things are coming through the back door. And you've got to be alive to that. Do not think that what's just hit you is the sole method of exploitation. It is likely to include, it's a bit like an ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missile, and it's got about 10 warheads inside one warhead. Okay? And they're all primed to go and do different things in different places. That's how advanced some of these weapons are starting to look like. The second thing is the attack surface. Like most companies, I call it the sugar cube. Okay? If you imagine that your company used to be one sugar cube, and you could protect the surface area of that sugar cube with a very old-fashioned, front door defense. What's happened is somebody's come along with a big hammer and smashed that sugar cube up and said, now operate your network with those small pieces. That has multiplied the surface area of your company. Okay? So it's no longer a front door. When somebody asked me the other day, what's the analogy? It said, the analogy is you've spent all your time making sure the front door and the windows were secured, and then some swine has come along and built 12 new front doors and given keys to a bunch of people you don't know often who they are. Sometimes they're giving keys directly to the customer, for Pete's sake. So suddenly you're having to think in a different way to protect the network. So that attack surface has changed. What we've got to protect against has changed. Okay? The second thing is, for us, we are looking to be a digital integrator of global logistics. We are moving big time into being a digital company. So data is king. Data is the new gold. Okay? Anybody sitting there thinking the disruptive nature of the attack is still there. Don't get me wrong, we're protecting against disruption. But actually, loss of commercial data is now becoming even more critical. That commercial data is gold. What the bad guys are trying to do is get that commercial data and sell it, because they'll make more money than just simply disrupting your network. Okay? And that's the issue. Data is gold. What are we doing about data integrity and all those, what used to be known, and no offense to anybody who's a data security expert in the room, but data used to be the boring bit, didn't it? Okay? Let's just focus on the disruptive side. Data is not the boring bit now in the nature of our digital businesses. Data is king. We've got to work out how we manage that data. The good old CIA around data has to apply, okay? And we have to work that out. Finally, OT. For manufacturing companies and companies like ourselves, some swine has come along and put flipping IP addresses on all my engines, okay? What have I got to do? Well, that engine's suddenly become a node on my network. I've now got to protect the engines in my ships. I've got to protect the automated cranes. I've got to protect my warehouse, automated warehouse capability. One of our warehouses in China makes one of Amazon's look really small, and it's fully automated. So how do I protect the IP-driven machines inside that factory? Is becoming even more of a challenge. And finally, that data piece I've talked about, data theft, is a real worry because of the black market in data. Okay, that is key, understanding that black market. I'm conscious of time, so the other issue is the balance. It's somebody earlier, and I heard them say it, said probably the most important thing was brand and image. Yes, it is. Don't get me wrong. And particularly if you're a bank, clearly, if you're a TSB customer, for instance, but if you're in a bank, you'd worry about the brand and reputation and trust, because you're going to lose clients quite quickly if that's lost. And clearly, that's really, really important. But you've got to expect these nation-state weapons can get in. If you are the collateral victim of a big weapon that goes off in the middle, and you're not in the middle of the war between that country and another country, they just fire a cyber weapon, you just happen to be the victim because you've got offices, you're a global company, you're going to be hit. Can you stop it? To a degree, yes. Can you fully stop its impact? Possibly no. Therefore, what should you invest in? Recovery. Many, many companies and many CEOs still have a mindset that 100% protection is possible, and that's what you should focus on. As a vendor, I thought that was brilliant, because I could sell millions of dollars worth of protective capability and walk away smiling, knowing that despite me selling multi-million dollars worth of protective equipment, the chances are that high-end nation weapons will still get through. And they are getting through. So what should you do? Well, you should equally invest in what I call contain and recover. So contain an impact should it occur better, and then recover the capability to minimize loss. So go from $300 million of loss to X million dollars of loss. Actually, that appeals to the CFO in many ways. Now, if you're a brand-centric company, that's not the same issue. You're going to invest much more in the protection. But if you are less worried about the brand piece, particularly in the manufacturing space, then you should be looking at that recovery and containment equally. And then finally, one of the golden lessons we learned during the attack was that the IT department used to be those bunch of geeks that nobody talked to. Okay? They were just accepted. That is not the case in any business anymore. The joy of being in IT is you are the business, particularly in digital industries where we're all going. You know, these businesses cannot move forward without us being integrated with them. And that applies to cyber. So when the business folks come up with a new product, you've got to be integrated into that product development from day one. It's not just DevOps. This is actually the business DevOps, as I call it, where you're absolutely upfront with the business, trying to work out what they're trying to do and why. So you're going to create a direct relationship with the client in the middle of that country. Really? Okay, let's work out how we're going to protect our data, because that is a particularly high threat scenario. And you've got to get in early before it goes too far down. Applying the lessons. So what did we do? And I came in to help implement this plan. Arguably, I went in because my CEO gave me a lot of money. Okay? Not personally, I hasten to add, but gave me money for a cyber program that would enable us to rebuild and put in place cyber capability. Now, that cyber capability, by the way, many of our peers in the industry have done the same thing. So realizing that they saw what happened to us and they're doing the same thing in their areas. We had a 90-day plan, and that first 90-day plan was to rebuild and put in place heightened protective capability at our endpoints. So, and I'm not going to hide the fact that we use CrowdStrike for our endpoints, and it's really good. Okay? Anybody out there from CrowdStrike, well done. It's a good bit of EDR capability. And it helps a lot, because what it allows you to do is take breath. As you rebuild your security organization and put more people in with the skills you need, the actual thing about CrowdStrike is it sort of helps you automate a lot of that endpoint protection. And it's really, really good. But it isn't the only method we clearly want to use. We had that 3-year program. We're now just coming up to 2 years into the program. Got a year left. It's been hard work. But the real focus is that balance of containment, application vulnerability fix, and working on our recovery measures. We now have contingency plans at all our ports and terminals, and you'd be surprised how some of our stevedores who operate in the ports now understand what to do in the event of a cyber crisis. I mean, these people have no education, some of them, yet we now train them to deal with a cyber incident should it occur. And they know what to do. It's like all their ready measures. We treat cyber like safety, because in Danish, safety and security is the same word. Therefore, we've decided that it makes sense to put cyber inside our safety within our safety mindset, so that people think safety, think cyber. And that is really paying off, big time. It's really hard to get people to think cyber. If you associate it with safety and test them, funnily enough, it works. So that's one of the things we've been doing. But I've talked about the 3 areas we focused on. The engine room, Active Directory. So we now look at how we can make that more resilient. And it's about resilience of your Active Directory node. Many of you in the room who are smarter than I and are in the white hat hacking territory will know that Active Directory is, as currently delivered in DNS and DHCP, as currently delivered by Microsoft, has vulnerabilities. Can we stop and protect all those vulnerabilities? Not necessarily. What we can do is mitigate the impact of those vulnerabilities being exploited. And we focus quite a lot of time and attention on that. Privileged access. Hands up, those of you who know how many people in your company have privileged rights to your network. 1 hand, 2 hands, okay? There is a problem, okay? Because of the method by which people can get privileged rights in Microsoft-based networks. It's a nightmare. You've got to introduce a draconian method to prevent people having too many high privilege accounts. Least privilege is king, and we have reduced the number of privileged holders in our account massively for that reason. It is a massive thing to do. It's painful. We've used CyberArk as the key capability to do that, but it is painful to get the process in place to manage that. You've got to do it. And the third area is around the business critical applications. How many of you know which are the business critical applications in your company? The ones that are on what I call the real top end, end-to-end process. Because most companies don't, strangely enough. We learnt which were our critical applications. It's the old classic turn it off, and when the first person who squeals probably means it's important. Okay? That's a good way of finding out, but I wouldn't recommend doing it. We were lucky, because we were able to then re-establish what our business critical applications were and our end-to-end processes. So we mapped our business processes end-to-end and saw where our key applications sat on those processes, because that allowed us really critically to move forward. So I'm going to go back one. A number of things quickly at the bottom. We've put 3 target operating models in place: GRC, security operations, and secure by design. Because every day you don't have a secure by design model in place to prevent people building bad security in, you create a vulnerability to be exploited. You've got to train all your developers, train all your users to adopt a secure by design mindset, and that's been painful. We've placed standards. I hate the word policy, by the way, it's banned. Policy is just dust, okay? Standards are king. You introduce standards and you draconianly apply those standards and make sure people use them. The other issue is exercise and training. I call out my SOC. No-notice call-outs of my SOC are very regular. I'm hated, okay? Because they get up at 3 o'clock in the morning just to say they're there, all right? That's important. You've got to rehearse your security operating procedures in real time and see how they work, and that helps you understand how the organization works. I'm going to leave a bit of time for questions, so I'm just going to go over the OT piece. The thing about OT that's really important is, notice the word framework. That's another word I've banned, by the way. Okay? Framework is an excuse for not doing things. Okay? Oh, I built the framework. Yeah, great. Does it work? Okay? So frameworks are important, but we've built 2 frameworks, one around the OT side and one around the IT side. Why 2, do you think? And I'm an engineer by background and training. Okay? IT people used to be the scum of the earth to me. Okay? Now, you're not now, you're lovely people. But the reality of life is that engineers see you as a threat because they're running their machines, and now they're putting this IT on their machines, and you're coming in to tell them how to run their machines? Really? So you've got to create an environment where the engineers running that OT and the enterprise IT guys can talk and work together. There are 2 frameworks, but they're federated. In other words, on top of that, we look down and we control those 2 frameworks. The bow tie model, by the way, is that we have a balance of reactive and proactive controls. As I mentioned earlier, don't put all your eggs into one basket. I'm going to jump over these 2 slides. Okay, 4 key principles. And by the way, I forgot to mention at the beginning that there is an exam at the end. Okay? You all have to pass the exam before you're allowed to leave. No mumbling in a minute. I'm actually going to give the exam away. In a second, I'm going to take you through the 5 security operating principles that everybody in my company has to be able to tell me in a lift. Sounds a little bit draconian, doesn't it? But everybody, from the lowest guy working on a ship as one of our crew, right through to the CEO, has to understand what the 5 are as part of their training. These are the 4 principles that we built our strategy around. The most important one of those, by the way, is visibility. Visibility, visibility, visibility. If you can't see it, you can't fix it. And that's really one of the biggest problems we have. But here are the 5. Remember them, because right at the end, I'm going to test you. Okay? Everybody is responsible for security. Okay? That's really important. Not just me. It's not just Andy Powell. Okay? It's everybody. And I hold everybody accountable. But critically in the business, I've held the business accountable for cyber risk, not me. I've pushed and devolved cyber risk to the business. So I actually have the guy who runs the ships owning cyber risk on vessels. That's part of it. Third is trust. Build trust with your clients, because we have found that we've got customers flocking back to us to do business with us because they trust us. There might be the fact that we've been hit once and therefore lightning doesn't strike twice, but I don't think that's true. I think they're coming back to us because they see that we've put investment into building secure supply chains for them. And that's growing our business by up to 20%. Fourth, resilience. As I mentioned earlier, don't just protect, be able to react and recover. And finally, that security is a benefit, not a burden. And that's really, really for our developers' sakes. Are you remembering those 5? Because you're going to shout them back at me at the end. All right? And we've also been getting our credentials. Some of you, certainly in the UK, will be aware of Cyber Essentials Plus. We won 2 contracts by getting Cyber Essentials Plus. That's quite appealing to the CFO and the Chief Commercial Officer. For those of you out there who think it's just bumper stickers, it isn't. I think it's important because it shows that you've got somebody, third party, showing that you're getting to the right place. And SOC 2 certification as well on our supply chain. So, before I go into any questions, can you remember the 5 security operating principles without mumbling? Number 1, everybody's responsible. Very good. Number 2, you're not all saying this. Number 2, very good. Number 3, trust. Number 4, come on, you're getting there. And the most important one, it's a benefit, not a burden. Okay? Everybody at Top Hat should go around saying, I am a benefit. Okay? Not a burden, because that's how you some people perceive. Okay, I've got time for questions. Floor's open. Any question you like. I'm a lifelong Liverpool fan, so chances of Liverpool winning the Premiership this season, pretty good. Oh, sorry, I'll come back to you in a sec, if you can get a microphone.
Hi. Over here.
Oh, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So, do you think, I don't think it should be a blame game, but vendors are promising you 100% coverage and all this nonsense. Do you think they should be held accountable when this kind of stuff happens? You were a vendor, as you said. You know how this game works, but
yeah,
it ends up this way when we believe their claims.
Yeah, it's a really, really, really good question. Thank you for that. I'm not sure it's. I'm happy with the question, but let me go ahead. Should vendors be accountable? There are lots of variables when you implement a cyber solution. I'll say that now as a vendor. The one thing I used to hate was unlimited liability clauses in contracts, because most vendors just shy away, from those unlimited liability clauses, because there are so many uncontrolled factors in the way that capability is landed in the organization, that to be held fully, have full liability cover is really hard. So one of the key things is most contracts negotiate about 100% to 200% liability on failure of that particular piece of capability, which is really up to the cost of the product sold. Is that the right approach? I think most vendors would not be happy going to unlimited liability, and you'd struggle. But the real issue is a two-way process. Okay? I think what we're doing with our vendors, by the way, is I have put this year that coming is the year of sustainment for me. I've landed all this new capability. It's great. I've landed all these new tools, and all the vendors are all thinking they can walk away. But as an ex-vendor, I'm not letting them. They're going to sit with me until I'm happy it's sustainable. And when it's sustainable and we've ironed out the bugs, then I'm happy. And that's part of the deal we've reached for them as they've come in. So I think it's really, the answer to your question is you change the dynamic of how you bring the vendor in. You don't just let them give you a black box and walk away. You ask them to open the black box up and explain it, and then be around for it when it goes off. Okay? And the vendor that stays is the vendor I trust. Does that make sense? And it's hard, don't get me wrong, it's hard. But having been a vendor, I would love to walk away and then go and sell something else. But when somebody holds me to account, I go, okay. But I can then build some trust. And actually, if you start building trust, you might get more business, if that makes sense. So, in answer to your question, it's a dynamic. You mustn't let them walk away. Good question. Yeah, another question.
Yeah, so you mentioned in the slides that you talked to the person who brought the malware, and I'm just curious, how did that play out?
Well, I wasn't around, but the individual came forward, actually, to speak to us. And what they told us sort of indicated to us that what they were saying was, they were the likely person involved in developing the weapon. That was a conversation, clearly, with no attribution at the time. We wanted to understand what had happened. That person was protected, by the way, under their state law. But we were able to get quite a lot from that individual about the nature of the exploits, particularly the fourth exploit, which they developed. And that's helped us quite a lot. One of the golden lessons that I didn't put up was forensics. Every time we currently have a failed cyber attack, I always have a forensics investigation, even if it seems quite small, because every event that you're trying to deal with teaches you something, even if it's quite small. So we will always do a forensics backup. So for those of you in forensics companies, you're probably rubbing your hands going, how do I get on Andy's framework? Okay, and there is a framework. But we do forensics all the time. We learn all the time. And what we're starting to see, we're sharing. So one of the reasons I'm in a suit is I'm off to go and visit some people in London to talk about those sorts of things. So we have to share. Can I be honest with the folks in this room? We have to share what we know about how these things work, openly, to stop them, if that makes sense. Good question. So one more question, then. A few more minutes.
Why do you think that especially you were chosen by the state-level attack? And what do you think of the whole movement into the cloud with this background? Because I think the cloud is really good to protect for a medium resource adversary, but very hard against a state-level adversary.
Yeah, so let me answer the question. So there were about 600 companies impacted, not just us. Any company doing business in the Ukraine that had to file a tax return was hit. Okay, let's be clear. So it wasn't just Maersk, we were collateral victim. We just happened to be in Kiev, operating in Ukraine. And most of the key companies that were hit were doing business in Ukraine. There were some very, very big companies in America who never said anything about what happened to them, but they were very big and got hit quite hard. In fact, two of them harder than us, I think. So we were not alone, but we were collateral victim. We weren't the intended target. The intended target was the Ukrainian government. We just happened to sadly be linked to that at the time. That's the first thing. So I would ask anybody who knows those companies who didn't open up, they should, because it'd be interesting to understand what the lessons were that they learned in the event. The second piece about the cloud is a really interesting one. I'm a huge advocate of clearly moving to the cloud, but I'm also a huge advocate that cloud-based security is in need of help. There's a lot more work needed in cloud security than there's currently there. No offense to anybody from Azure or Amazon, but I don't trust the baked-in security in cloud. And therefore, we are wrapping our cloud services in additional security, and you should. Because at the end of the day, you've got to understand, if you're moving a lot of your sensitive data and operations and capability into the cloud, you want to make sure it's protected. Are you going to rely on the third party doing that for you in the cloud? Not necessarily, if that makes sense. So there's a lot of work to be done in cloud security. So anybody in cloud security companies, I'd buy more shares, okay? Because a lot more needs to be done before big companies like us start to trust, that full cloud-based approach. Does that answer what you're after? Yeah. Any other questions? Because we're down to the last minute or so. I keep getting cards flashed at me. 5 minutes, okay.
Over here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
As you're an ex-RAF officer and military man, aren't you in danger of fighting the last war here? Isn't that a problem? So the attack that kind of hit you was developed probably a year or two before it hit you, and you were a side effect.
Yeah.
The danger here is that more weapons have been developed over the next few years.
Yeah.
What's your assessment?
That's a really good question. My assessment is I've told my people not to trust me for that reason. So what we've done is we've brought in a red team capability who, if you like, act as our forward lookers. They're looking at the horizon from a red team point of view and looking at the emerging threats. And they're constantly testing me to say, what you're doing, Andy, is great, to your very good point 2 years ago. Will it protect us from this new development that we're seeing over here? And the answer to that is, shoot. Okay, best we do a bit of test and adjust. So to your point, every organization and every CISO needs a conscience to test them. And I deliberately did that because of that very good point about fighting the last war. I want to fight the next war and be ready for it. So that's why I brought in the red team capability. They're about 19 in age, and they look young, and really young. Younger than most people in this room, seriously. They wear ripped jeans and nose rings. No offense to those wearing ripped jeans and nose rings. And they talk in a language I don't understand. Okay? But they're brilliant, because what they're doing is thinking laterally and thinking in ways I wouldn't think of. I'm just a guy in a suit, okay? What they're thinking and bringing is original and unique thinking. And you've all got to do that. Every big organization needs somebody to do that. And to your point, that's what we've tried to do, is bring in that sort of test and adjust. So our threat, we're building a threat information platform, and that TIP is being populated by that sort of thinking. Okay? We're also bringing in government agencies to give us their emerging thinking as well. So we're bringing in the Danish, the UK, and other governments to give us their thoughts. And so that to me, is what you all should do. If you don't have a threat platform in your company, you need one. And you need to populate it with some lateral thinking. Then you need to run some red team-based exercises on what you've done. Bring in people to try and break it. It's not an open invitation, by the way, to this audience. Please don't, because I get quite grumpy. But the reality of life is we do bring in red teams to come and do. It's not old-fashioned pen testing, by the way. I used to run pen testing teams. I know what pen testing teams can do. We're not doing pen testing in the traditional sense. We're asking people to be smart and think smartly and then test us with those sorts of questions and test us with those sorts of approaches. Then we can try and think. So my tier 3 analysts, and I think Lewis is here in the room who they work for, my tier 3 analysts, I'm asking them to be my red team, not my tier 3 analyst. I want them to be the red team. I want them to think hard about how people could get around what we've put in place. So a long-winded answer to a very good question, but the answer is I have bought a conscience to test me. I think we're almost out of time. That's time for one more question. One more question.
I don't know. I think you didn't cover it in the slides. Did you think about having completely a mock-up, backup of your entire infrastructure, which is on the standby, and then which you can flip over in case when you lose everything? So I know it's very expensive to maintain it, because when I was threat analyst myself, so that was my recommendation to give to the customers, because especially in the medical, you lost, you can't perform operation. But the problem is that the cost of maintaining the complete backup is extremely expensive. Mostly airlines are doing that. So did you consider that? Did you calculate costs? Is it worth it?
Right, so one thing I didn't show is one of the best things our partner, and we employed Deloitte as our partner to help us over the last 3 years with the program. It sounds like an advertisement for Deloitte, but they did bring a very smart approach. And we used a risk-based triangle. And at the top of that triangle were what we call the extinction events to bigger events. And then we worked our way down so that below a certain level in the triangle, systems that only had a localized effect that were damaged, we do stuff about, but we're not investing as much in, if that makes sense. But everything at the top of the triangle, on those business critical processes, that we've got those 5 processes that run our company, we have backed those up. So we know how we can operate them in the event of those 5 key processes not working. What I have not done is invest in all the ones below a certain line. And it's a risk-based approach. To your very good point, you can't back up everything because it would just basically build a second company. And even my CFO might not like me very much if I did that. So the reality is you've got to have a risk-based approach. The risk-based triangle is king. And then you've got the hardest bit is to find where you draw the line, because it's really hard to get the business to do that. The old Billy Connolly sketch is I want everything and I want it now applies, and there's not always enough money. So you've got to work out through the risk triangle. I think that's it. I think we've run out of time, but many, many thanks. Thanks for your time.